Hello, my name is Omar Kholeif, and I'm a professor at the Glasgow School of Art. And welcome to Curating Collections for the Diasporic Imagination. I'd just like to acknowledge the image behind me is by Joanna Hadjitoma and Khalid Juraj, and it's from a film called The Smyrna, which is a film about return and belonging. Although in this case, that return and belonging is one that is reserved for the imagination. I'm going to share some slides with you now in the hope that I'll be able to elucidate a little bit further on the points that I was trying to make or could have made were I there in person. In the background, we have Amazing Grace. Although perhaps not everything feels so amazing this particular juncture. When the world is under siege, I can't help but think of this particular work by Lawrence Abu Hamdan called Air Pressure, a work that considered the role of a particular kind of sonic warfare, an invisible warfare that penetrated into the aural landscape. As I sit here reading of invisible missile carriers landing in Gloucestershire, about to take off to shoot over Iran, I can't help but feel ever more removed from the context of where I am from and who I am. How does one begin to discuss the context of collecting and the very notion of collections, whether in reference to the brick and mortar of the so-called formerly anointed Universal Museum or the private collections of contemporary art and antiquity that are the preserve of moneyed individuals? Well, the point of this presentation, which is collecting for the diasporic imagination, is that we're speaking and indeed cohering this discussion from the perspective of an individual who has spent most of their life living as a vessel in the diaspora, never once more to one place, constantly seeking the concept of home and using vestiges such as objects, including the ones before us by Monira Al Qadiri, as emblems of place, of belonging. Indeed, this presentation has been visioned in the context of creative visual artist Monira Al Qadiri's creative practice and was in no small part inspired by her installation, The Archaeology of Beasts, pardon me, which I fell into by chance on a rare trip to Brussels at the Beaux-Arts, and I shall return to this. I should like to reiterate that in an age where conflict is as distanced as a video game, in an instant now to invoke Clarice Lispector, where the diasporic body is constantly in threat of returning to a state of exile, that collections in this context extend tremendously beyond any mere notion of ornament or artifact. Indeed, collections are equally the fundamental choices that we make when we flee to stir and reactivate the seeds of the diasporic imagination. Collections are specific editions of books, diaries, albums, family heirlooms, crockery, jewelry, and clothing passed down for generations. Pens, notebooks, cameras, film stock, sound equipment, cassette tapes, CDs, and other archival material, Betacams, Beta SPs. Remember a floppy disk, anyone? Or old laptops? Photo negatives, silver gelatin prints, watercolors, works on paper, correspondence, postcards. These have long been a certain preserve, a belonging, a descendant, root, or force of the ancestor, the vestiges that preserve a particular kind of social imagination, one that as humans we use to wander with, to enable us from getting lost. It allows us as individuals to maintain a semblance of self. The noted curator, Lucy R. Lippard, in 2023 published a book entitled Stuff instead of a memoir. Here, a life is narrated through rocks, ceramic plates, buttons, unnamed vessels, rugs, family photos, as well as innumerable examples of her own art. These were exhibited in an exhibition at the New Mexico Museum of Art, where the curator lives, in an exhibition entitled Lucy R. Lippard, Notes from the Radical Whirlwind. The museum is to receive the majority of these works as a promised gift. Amongst these vestiges, heirlooms, objects, included woodcuts, many woodcuts created by the curator herself, reminding us that curators too often are artists. Photographs that she herself had taken, which exist alongside works of art gifted to her by some of modernism's most recognizable figures, such as Louise Bourgeois, Sol LeWitt, and Robert Ryman. That there is no hierarchy, seemingly, between what constitutes the high and the low, the indigenous, the local, the sacred, the native, the personal, is what I believe makes this memoir so particularly beautiful, a collection, a constellation of things. In 2022, the Palestinian American artist Khalil Rabah invited me to engage him in a dialogue around the exhibition called Relocation, Among Other Things. It took place at the Salzburg Kunstverein. Existing under the rubric of his nomadic museum, the Palestinian Museum of Natural History and Humankind, a project that began in 2003 and which is ongoing, it was presented rather differently than I had ever experienced it before. Or at least that was the result. Rabah's museum presented here in a manner where seemingly formal and informal objects seem to bear no clear hierarchy, although there always is a hierarchy, where a pocket watch, a cassette tape player, tarpaulin, and detritus are all segmented as ethnographic objects that belong to moments in time that are bounded up in a logic and reason that are particular to only himself was peculiar to me. Fishing nets, picture albums, and suitcases were distributed piecemeal. They were collected from different institutional structures and accrued using different financial frameworks and structures. What this show sought to set up was a stage or a scenography for one to bear witness to the erasure of particular histories. But Khalil Rabah did not want them to be mere ethnographic objects, but living things. So he invited me to create something quite peculiar, which was to become his interlocutor in creating indexical data for them through a form of lyric and prose throughout the gallery. The process of putting this together resulted in a live performance where I, who at the time was injured with a broken foot and wearing a giant space boot of a sort, interviewed him as the notable museum director of the Palestinian Museum of Natural History and Humankind, played a game of tender and exchange where we broke down the semantics of indexicality until the narrative eventually descended into one regarding restitution, which, as we all know, is a polemic in any Western institution. A performed argument subsequently ensued. What I was seeking to demonstrate here was that in the context of the diasporic imagination, the phantasmic accumulation of visual and spoken languages, myths and their afterlives, that citizens, and I mean all citizens, even those not holding a passport or a clear genesis to a land, or who bear a right to construct or consolidate or assume what is believed to be a composite notion of an imagination, that for them collections can engender a form of self. For collections, again, I assert, are a vestige, a node, a blanket, a site of joining, as well as a connective tissue to a constitution of home, whatever semblance or form that may take for the individual. This was the subject of an exhibition that I curated in 22 and again in 2023, entitled In the Heart of Another Country, The Diasporic Imagination Rises, which was staged at the Dijksterhal in Hamburg and again at the Sharjah Art Foundation. The reason these slides are empty is that I had originally intended to use this time to speak of my time as a custodian of public collections in museums in Britain, the United States, and in West Asia. But I felt uncomfortable doing this, because what did it mean to inherit a legacy and be charged with the responsibility of assembling a narrative that is representative of years of a time and a place, and at times not only collections that were alien to me, but which explicitly excluded individuals such as myself. Explicitly, as in, yes, were racist or prejudicial towards individuals such as myself from within the very canonical formation of their constitution. And what right does one have when one leaves the armature of that institution to be able to continue to speak on that behalf, especially in moments of crisis, especially in moments of conflict? Often we are said or informed that as curators, as museum directors, as institutional leaders, that our role is to perform a reparative act within the institution, within the museum. But I believe that often is more of a balancing act, and we can make a very clear example of that when we speak about the gender balance in art history. None of us are actually repairing history, we are balancing history. The corrective act, as many a museum director has sought to do, might require a very different methodological approach were we to truly elicit change in collecting. And that does require a very particularly contemporary gaze, a gaze that perhaps belongs to artists. Professor Sarah Perks, working with a curator called Michael Connor, introduced me to the concept of the art of with when I was a senior curator at an institution called Corner House in the UK some 16 years ago. This was an act of reaching out across the table and convening a program collaboratively in a way. And it was achieved in a manner that I had not seen before, in that it was not about creating a focus group, but about, in a sense, constellating a world where the institution itself was formed in the very essence of its staffing and its structure from within the very central nodes of the community. The artist Fiaster Gates, I would say, deepened my knowledge of the recuperative process of collecting via his approach to thinking of the artist as an institution, which I came to understand in greater detail and proximity in my years living and working in Chicago. Uh, in that time, I was sort of gobsmacked by the birth of the Rebuild Foundation, which really is a vector through which Fiaster Gates's practice, or one vector through which Fiaster Gates's practice operates. And seeing this living organism, the Stony Island Arts Bank, cohere and convene these various archives, such as the Frankie Knuckles record collection, um, collections of Japanese and Afro-Menge ceramics, libraries of discarded books, an acquisition of the Ebony and Jet photo archive. I was able to see how the institution operating from within the bounds or through the guise of the artist could create a vessel for the artist to continue to produce their work, but also afford something to their community by creating civic and public spaces in buildings that were disinherited, where there were seats of disenchantment, or in sites that were completely seen as otherwise violent. So indeed, the Rebuild Foundation became an umbrella to archive, index, and acquire a panoply of interests that fueled a creative practice. But the community remains and remains a necessary impulse. And I suppose I was reminded of this during a rehearsal for a gospel concert when there was this mixed ability choir that was rehearsing, and I asked if I could attend a rehearsal. and I was informed that I was more than welcome to attend so long as I was a member of the neighborhood, so long as I was willing to partake and I wasn't merely an interloper. And so also that idea of being invited is being invited by that community. And I also was able to bear witness to Fiaster's generosity in the form of his invitation to the artist Carlos Bunga, who presented in the left screen here the inaugural commission in the Stony Island Arts Bank. And as Carlos articulated it to me, he met Fiaster at the Artis Mundi Awards, for which they were both nominated. And Fiaster, I believe, won that year. And that is when he invited him to partake and to be a part of this project. And for anyone who knows the work of Carlos Bunga, he's often known for using upcycled or reused materials and creating architectural paintings, models, cinema, truly emotional sculpture, emotional abstraction in situ in these sites. And it was truly a marvelous convening. And this structure here at the end of the installation in the performance of the Black Monks was raised from its position. But as we pause for a second here, as we reach kind of or pass through beyond the halfway point of my thinking here and my ideas, I want to consider what are the modes of dreaming of a collection and of collecting for the diasporic imagination. For several years now, I've been working under and developing the umbrella or rubric of what I refer to as dream work. Dream work is a form of social imagination that argues for the necessary act of dreaming. By this, I'm speaking of the safeguarding of visual and oral culture, dreaming being protected against authoritarianism, and indeed to protect dreaming, as in dreaming is the connection, the sustained connection to ancestral knowledge. I was inspired by several great women to this point of thought, and chief among them is Professor Jean Fisher, who seemed to look at the world sideways. An art writer, visual artist, post-colonial thinker, and zoologist and medical scientist by training, her encouragement was that I see to my own history, to interrogate my own personhood, and to create my own specific sensual erotics for art, my own movements, my own ways of seeing and feeling my way through certain objects. Then, of course, Toni Morrison's adage that if you have freedom, then you must pass it on served as a second point of incubation in that it encouraged me to protect artists. Indeed, that is the curative prospect of and potential of being a curator. Students and others with the principles and ethics to realize the scope of their ambition are aware that if you have the freedom, you must pass it on. And that is what I attempt to do as we get closer and closer into the space of looking into the void of the collection, the void of the whole of the space, metaphorically or not. And of course, Saidiya Hartman's ekphrastic use of storying, or what is referred to as critical fabulation, returned me to literary roots and the significance of narrative in completing the gaping holes or fissures in history. Just because someone's life was destroyed or lost to time does not mean that we should not constitute links that might allow it to hang and be threaded into the soil. So, what are the methods of curating collections for the diasporic imagination? And I came to realize that I was born in Cairo, Egypt, to Sudanese and Egyptian parents, moved to Scotland at 3 months old. At 7, a violent racial attack left me with a neurological condition that was debilitating. We returned to Egypt and we moved to the west coast of the United States. We stayed in the United States and then we moved to the Gulf. I returned to Scotland again at the age of 17 to attend university, where I teach today. I finished. I moved down the country. I studied and worked, and then flew back out to the US and then again back to the Arabian Gulf. And only a year ago back for the third time, returning to Scotland again. In this constant loop, I've been carrying sediments of history. And those sediments are things that have grown from kinship with artists, but also kinship with family members who have been lost, with people who have chosen a life of exile, others who have been exiled forcibly. And I realized that those objects became thousands: books, artworks, papers, not least my own. Because as I always say, it is not that I am prolific, it is that I am someone who likes to audition in plain sight. I am someone who is constantly putting things out there in search of an audience, in search of a public, in search of a community. And so the first thing that I did was to absolve myself of the concept of home itself and to take on a lease on an open access climate controlled storage facility and to work with one of my friends who's an artist on building modular storage walls using upcycled ply and other forms of wood that we would find that could move and that would hold what we had. And we created and rendered the world. And this person was called Levin Hagel, and they created a company themselves this time. Levin also was a mixed race individual who ontologically maybe doesn't present as such, just like I ontologically maybe don't present the way that I perhaps should. And in the process of thinking of how to distribute, anchor, and parse and divide this space, I started to ask, is there a single method of displaying the diasporic imagination in a collection? Well, there's the way of all collecting and consolidating or constituting all collections, which is to think of the audit, what is there, what thematic focus is there, or the diasporic imagination for many of us who have lived lives in exile, whether that exile is chosen or not, is a sense of the uncanny when connecting to these objects. But what of and for those who do not connect? Well, we are required to create a sense of context. So that means contextual objects and contextual feelings, contextual language, and representation. And there has to be an umbrella of or metaphor of how you think about this. So every collection has its distinctive quality. So every nation is personified as male or female. Often we tend to use the female as linchpin, as metaphor of the matrilineal line, because it can give life or give birth to its children, its society. But also that patriarchal structure is also what limits certain strata of the imagination, i.e., prevents women's work from being seen in such collections. So how do we think of a collection of several people, or indeed as constellation to invoke, which I've mentioned before, the term constellation, to not only invoke the late Ockham Razor's concept of the post-colonial constellation, but to invoke the very broad concept of constellation as something that can never truly be knowable, as there are so many galaxies that exist beyond the realm of human consciousness of knowing. To think of it as a kind of black matter, if you will, to invoke Stefano Harvey and Fred Merton as something that is inherently present, but that cannot be seen. What is the nexus point? What is the convening? What is it that we are attempting to do? The truth in the end will always be contingent upon resources. The truth is that it will always be culturally situated. The truth is that we can only imagine certain diasporas because we have not met them all, because that diasporic condition is also conditioned by the context of the ensuing violence that continues to rupture and seed new seats of memory, trauma, and hopefully we as curators will be able to use collections to sow, amend, and heal using art as vestiges for radical love and radical healing. To be able to identify the needs of to be able to identify the needs of a diaspora that is in constant mourning. I sit here presenting this to you with many members of my family in places where they cannot cross borders, with airspaces closed, with friends and former colleagues in the same situation, wondering where did this all come from and what relevance does it hold? It all began under an umbrella of hosting a collection of publications, an invitation to imagine otherwise, to imagine a different way of writing about art and art's history, a series of pocket-sized biographies on female worlding, on women artists who did not have a book offered about them in English at the time of commissioning. I feel deep pain and sadness as I sit here because what was visioned as something truly collaborative, and indeed it is truly collaborative, did end up being something that could be prone in many instances to certain kinds of extraction. And the bulk of the labor, if you will, the propensity to story, to narrate, to give levity, to give heft, to give weight, to create context. That is not a gift that everybody holds. And so when I created this series, I imagined it as a modular score that I would be able to hand over to different people after 6 books. And as I arrive now to book 6, I realize there's no one else who would be willing to do that work. Why? Because the world is as we see it, in flux and in deep pain. But also, if you ontologically don't present in the way or guise that people deem or wish you to be, are you a convenient vessel? Well, we must not stick to any such stricture, nor must we be confined. For as I learned in creating this podcast, listening with artists, I was liberated knowing that people who could name drop philosophers, and let me be honest, people who could cite Heidegger in pages and pages of length, having memorized them, being able to equally weep to the sound of Tori Amos with me, gave me in the same breath, um, it just gave me breath actually. To then move from that to discussing spy planes, to discussing growing up in Syria, or to be able to interview oneself or one's avatars. And the last remaining vestige then is, well, I guess you might want to see some of the objects that I carried on my back in suitcases sometimes, but always duties were paid, of course. Was the Dreamwork collection, which comes out of the concept of Dreamwork, is a collection of the diasporic imagination and its adjacencies. And because I do not have a home, in that I do not have a mortgage, I do not have a permanent apartment, I do not even have a rental lease at this particular moment, despite being situated at this present moment in the United Kingdom. Because I chose to invest everything in constituting this. I like to think of this collection as a house museum in perpetual exile, constituted through a diasporic lens of kinship with artists and estates. Here, lifelong friendships with artists, exhibition projects, collaboration, and commission realized across the globe have led to the consolidation of 4 collections housed under one roof. And this is what that wood that you saw earlier looks like. And it now pays home to deep holdings of work by Luisa Curia Pereira, who, for instance, is a figure who is the subject of the final of the Imagine Otherwise books. The work of Aboriginal artist Nora Wampi. The work of Haif Kahraman, Kurdish Iraqi artist, with whom I have written and worked and dreamed. The work of Muhammad Zia Rahman, the art of Helen Khal, as well as the work of Miko Veldkamp, Patti Smith, Peter Sedgley, Purvis Young, Nivira Ahmed, Lonnie Holy, and Donald Locke. And in doing so, I felt that there had to be nodules or nodes for being able to accession things, as there are not is not an infinite amount of space. Um, so the collection is devolved into 4 sections. The first is the Blake Gallagher collection of post-British and Commonwealth art. So this is basically art that is ostensibly deemed British art or of the Commonwealth areas, but post-British essentially means contemporary British art, i.e., art that is not attempting to cleave to empire thought, i.e., this is South African art post-apartheid, or South African art made during apartheid but was against apartheid. Then there is the Imagine Otherwise collection for women in the arts, and these are works that were by artists who were part of the Imagine Otherwise series, or whose publications, or who I produced publications, pardon me, about that was the result of either funding that was raised under the rubric of Imagine Otherwise, even if they were not directly within the framework of Imagine Otherwise. Then there is the Art Post 21 collection for art, technology, and social justice. And these are specifically online or net-based works that were commissioned for the website, or works that individuals who have come with funding, who have browser-based works, but want to have a physical vessel to deposit because of my love for all things material and digital being connected. And then there is the wedding art registry for me and my partner, because I never thought I was someone who would care for a wedding, but for those who know me or who attended my very impromptu wedding, I had my appendix had exploded rather suddenly, and I had experienced sepsis. Um, Luckily, I was okay. And so my partner and I we were going to get married, and we decided, well, I said, well, if I'm only going to get married once, then I might as well have a wedding. And so I funneled out, I think, circa 80 wedding invites, and we had about 70 guests, and they asked what should they bring, and we said art. And they were mostly artists. So, and alongside that, the idea is that they hold holdings of poetry, a library that connects to these works, and my own papers. And of course, sustaining this becomes a lifetime of work. And I suppose I return to this work, The Archaeology of Beasts by Monira Al Qadiri, because what really struck me about this work, which takes and creates a kind of series of portals between the living and the dead, between Egyptian myth and uh, which is always partly true, as we know. There is no such thing as a fake Egyptian myth. All Egyptian myths are based on fact, obviously. And the afterlife was the rendering and digitization of all of these souvenirs from Luxor. I was suddenly reminded of a work by Lothar Baumgarten called Unsettled Objects that I had acquired an artist proof of for the Charter Art Foundation collection, and which I had seen first in the Glasgow Museum's service, and that had truly changed my life, and but had also made me really think about the ethnographic museum as a site of um, really the body, how these objects are bodies that contain and are vestiges of memory and life that should not be forgotten, that should continue to be sites of dreaming. And indeed, it was interesting that when I was to read the text around the work, that um, you know, after departing the Beaux-Arts, I was kind of perplexed because maybe it was translated from French to English or Flemish to English. Wasn't quite sure, but eventually I read an interview of Monira, and it said, "Who qualifies as human? Who qualifies as beast? And is one's life worth more than the other?" feels ever so poignant, a question to ask in moments like these.